Most people covering North Korea are going to get this one wrong, not because the facts are hidden somewhere. Every single piece of this story is sitting in public documents, treaties, satellite imagery assessments, congressional testimony, defense ministry white papers. But because when you organize those facts around the wrong alliance, the one everybody talks about, the picture that emerges is completely, dangerously misleading. For 30 years, the operating assumption has been the same. China holds the leash. China is the one that keeps Kim Jong-un's regime alive. China is the one that blocks the toughest UN sanctions. China is the strategic backstop that prevents a complete implosion of the Korean peninsula. Pull China's support, and the Kim dynasty falls within months. That has been the bedrock of Western Korea strategy since 1994. That assumption is now structurally broken. And here is what nobody in the mainstream coverage is telling you plainly. The alliance that actually determines whether nuclear weapons get used on the Korean peninsula, the one that genuinely changed the risk calculus, is not with Beijing. It is with Moscow. Not as a diplomatic softening. Not as a temporary wartime arrangement. A formal, legally binding mutual defense treaty, signed June 19, 2024 in Pyongyang, with a clause that obligates Russia to provide military assistance using, and I want you to hear these words precisely, all means in its possession if North Korea comes under attack. All means. In a country with the world's largest nuclear arsenal. By the time I finish walking you through what that actually means, you will understand nuclear risk on the Korean peninsula more clearly than most people working in national security today. Here is the analytical framework this entire analysis runs on. Nuclear patron theory. Not who has the bomb, but who backs the person with the bomb. Because in nuclear strategy, the patron determines the threshold. The patron determines when the weapon actually gets considered for use. And the anchor number that explains everything that follows is 12,000. That is the number of North Korean combat soldiers that crossed into Russia in October 2024, according to the South Korean National Intelligence Service assessment, confirmed subsequently by both NATO intelligence and U.S. satellite imagery. Not aid workers, not agricultural delegations, combat troops deployed into Kursk Oblast, an active war zone, and taking casualties within weeks of arrival. 12,000 soldiers sent into a foreign war. In return, what traveled back in the other direction? The technology, the treaty guarantees, the strategic permission. That is precisely what this analysis is about. To understand why any of this matters, you have to go back to 1991. When the Soviet Union collapsed, North Korea lost the one thing that had kept it structurally secure since 1953, a nuclear-armed patron that made any American regime change operation geopolitically impossible. The Soviet umbrella came down overnight, and Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-un's grandfather, began watching very carefully what happened in the decade that followed. Iraq, 2003. Saddam Hussein had, by the time of the invasion, no weapons of mass destruction. He had wound down his programs under international pressure. He was removed from power and killed. Libya, 2011. Muammar Gaddafi gave up his entire nuclear weapons program voluntarily in 2003, under direct negotiations with the United States, in exchange for diplomatic normalization and the lifting of sanctions. 8 years after that handshake deal, NATO aircraft were in the sky over Tripoli, and Gaddafi was dead on the side of a road. Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un's father, watched both of those endings. He accelerated North Korea's nuclear program immediately after Libya. The lesson every generation of the Kim dynasty drew from the post-Cold War era is brutally precise. The only security guarantee that cannot be negotiated away is a nuclear weapon that demonstrably works, mounted on a missile that can demonstrably reach an American city. Nothing else holds. That is the structural foundation. The bomb is not a diplomatic chip. It is the regime's life insurance policy. And that understanding is critical because it tells you that North Korea will never, under any conditions that currently exist, give those weapons up voluntarily. Now, here is where the China assumption enters and where it has been for 30 years, partially correct but fundamentally incomplete. China did serve as North Korea's primary external patron. China accounts for roughly 90% of North Korea's total foreign trade, according to Korea Trade Investment Promotion Agency data as of 2023. Chinese oil flows into North Korea through pipelines that Beijing controls. When the UN Security Council voted on sanctions after the 2017 nuclear test, North Korea's largest, at an estimated 250 kilotons, China voted in favor. But Chinese implementation of those sanctions was selective, consistently incomplete, and deliberately so. Beijing's strategic calculation has always been a collapsing North Korea creates an unmanageable refugee crisis on our northeastern border, and potentially a unified Korea under American military alliance right at our doorstep. Neither of those outcomes is acceptable, so China sustains the regime while publicly condemning the weapons program. It is a deliberate contradiction, and both halves of it are genuine. But here is the structural limit of Chinese patronage that almost no mainstream Western analysis states clearly. China has never, not once, issued an explicit, public, legally binding commitment to defend North Korea if it is attacked. The 1961 Sino-North Korean Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance does contain a mutual defense clause, but Beijing has consistently, deliberately refused to confirm that clause is still operative. Chinese officials, when pressed directly on this question in international settings, give calculated non-answers. In 2017, the Chinese ambassador to the United States stated explicitly that if North Korea struck first in a conflict, China would remain neutral. Neutral. That one word matters enormously in nuclear deterrence theory, because deterrence only holds if the adversary believes the patron will respond. Now compare that deliberate vagueness to what Russia signed on June 19, 2024. Article 4 of the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Treaty between Russia and the DPRK. The language is not ambiguous. If either party is attacked, the other provides military and other assistance using all means in its possession. No ambiguity. No diplomatic escape clause. All means. Robert Carlin, former CIA analyst, one of the most consistently accurate Western observers of Pyongyang across 5 decades, described the June 2024 treaty as the single most significant shift in North Korean strategic alignment since the founding of the state. That is not hyperbole for an audience. That is a specific technical assessment from someone who has been reading this system since Kim Il-sung was alive. And here is where we reach the part that nobody is connecting clearly. Because what Russia actually handed Kim Jong-un in exchange for those 12,000 soldiers and over 1 million artillery shells, it was not just satellite technology, and it was not just submarine components. It was something that no missile part can replicate. It was proof of concept, and that proof was demonstrated live in Europe. Let me walk you through the 3 layers of what North Korea received in return for its military support to Russia. The first layer is technology, and it is the one that gets the most coverage. In November 2023, Russia provided technical assistance that directly enabled the launch of North Korea's Malayong-1 military reconnaissance satellite. The satellite, North Korea's first fully operational one, was placed into orbit using a launch vehicle that incorporated Russian propulsion expertise that North Korea had not independently demonstrated before. Satellite reconnaissance transforms military capability on the peninsula in ways that are difficult to overstate. The second layer is submarine and hypersonic development. The James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies assessed in late 2023 that North Korea's Hero Kim Kun-ok submarine, launched September 2023, described by Pyongyang as nuclear-capable, showed propulsion advances that did not follow logically from North Korea's own prior engineering trajectory. External assistance was the most plausible explanation. And Russia has the world's most operationally experienced submarine development program outside of the United States. Add to that the parallel development timelines between North Korea's hypersonic glide vehicle tests and Russia's Kinzhal operationalization. The technical overlap is difficult to attribute to coincidence. But here is the thing, all of that, the satellites, the submarines, the hypersonic research, is manageable in strategic terms. It complicates the security picture. It does not by itself fundamentally change the nuclear threshold. What changes the threshold is the third layer, the doctrine. Here is precisely what Kim Jong-un observed across 36 months of the Ukraine war. He watched Vladimir Putin reference nuclear weapons as a diplomatic instrument, not once, not twice, but systematically. Putin invoked Russia's nuclear capability in February 2022, September 2022, October 2023, and multiple times across 2024. Each invocation, the Western response recalibrated. Weapon systems that had been approved got quietly delayed. Decisions that NATO had been building toward got pulled back. The nuclear threat worked, not because anyone was certain Putin would launch, but because enough uncertainty existed that the risk of testing that uncertainty was too high. Kim Jong-un had attempted his own version of this twice, in 2017 and again in 2022. Both times the effect was limited. Joint U.S.-South Korea military exercises continued. Sanctions remained. The international community essentially treated North Korean nuclear threats as background noise in the regional security architecture. The difference now is fundamental. Russia has demonstrated something Kim Jong-un could never prove on his own, that nuclear coercion is viable in the current international environment, even when deployed against Western democracies, that the threat itself carries deterrent weight independent of actual use. That is the doctrine transfer. It is more consequential than any missile component, any satellite technology, any submarine design, because it recalibrates Kim Jong-un's own calculation about what his nuclear arsenal can actually achieve short of use. Now connect that to the Mutual Defense Treaty, because here is where this stops being a regional security problem and starts being a global one. South Korean military strategy, as outlined in the 2023 Defense White Paper published by South Korea's Ministry of National Defense, operates on a central assumption that in any peninsular conflict scenario, China's acute interest in peninsula stability creates a practical ceiling on North Korean escalation. Beijing will signal restraint through its established channels. Pyongyang will respond to that signal. The nuclear weapon stays in the realm of theoretical. That assumption now has a structural fracture in it. Because North Korea has a second patron, one that has demonstrated in a live conflict lasting more than 2 years that it will absorb international condemnation, multiple rounds of sanctions, and prolonged military attrition rather than back down. And that patron now has a written treaty obligation to Pyongyang. The two-patron problem in deterrence theory is not abstract. It is precisely the strategic configuration where miscalculation becomes most probable. Here is the part that nobody on television will say plainly. And the reason they won't say it is exactly the reason you need to hear it. The worst-case scenario on the Korean peninsula has already been partially stress-tested. It just ran in Eastern Europe. Let me walk you through the scenario that appears most consistently in the classified war game analyses, the ones that have partially surfaced through congressional testimony and strategic think tank publications. The trigger in almost every simulation is not a deliberate North Korean decision to strike first. Historically, and the evidence across 7 decades supports this, that is the least probable initiation path. Kim Jong-un is rational in the technical sense. He understands that a North Korean first strike ends his regime within days, and himself within weeks. He has no interest in dying for ideology. The more probable escalation path is a sequence. A naval incident in the Yellow Sea, something like the March 2010 sinking of the ROKS Cheonan, which killed 46 South Korean sailors and which North Korea never formally acknowledged. A miscalculation in a gray zone that spirals faster than the diplomatic backchannels can contain. South Korea retaliates under domestic political pressure that its government cannot resist. North Korea escalates, reading retaliation as the beginning of a regime change operation. The United States invokes its mutual defense treaty with Seoul. And for the first time in the history of the Korean security architecture, Kim Jong-un picks up a communications channel that now goes somewhere it never went before. Moscow. The RAND Corporation's December 2024 assessment of Korean Peninsula conflict scenarios, produced by a team that included former National Security Council staff members, placed the probability of nuclear use in a peninsular conflict, accounting for the new strategic environment post-June 2024 treaty, at between 20 and 30%. 20 to 30%. That is not a tail risk. That is not the kind of number you incorporate into a footnote. In financial risk terms, a 20 to 30% probability of catastrophic outcome is a number you build your entire institutional strategy around. Before the next part, something needs to stop here. The Korean peninsula has 51 million people on the southern side and 25 million on the northern side. Seoul, a city of 9.7 million, sits 35 miles from the demilitarized zone, within range of conventional North Korean artillery alone, entirely separate from nuclear considerations. The human cost of a conventional conflict on that peninsula, before a single nuclear weapon enters the calculation, is measured in hundreds of thousands of casualties in the first 72 hours. These are not strategic variables. These are families, entire neighborhoods, a civilization that rebuilt itself from complete physical destruction once already between 1950 and 1953. Every probability assessment in this analysis exists inside that human reality. It is worth holding that weight before continuing. Now, the gap between what officials say and what the evidence shows. The consistent official position from the US State Department and from NATO governments is that the Russia-DPRK relationship is a marriage of convenience, a transactional exchange driven by Russia's wartime ammunition needs that will naturally dissolve once the Ukraine conflict ends. That framing appeared in multiple State Department briefings across 2024. Here is what the observable record actually shows. The treaty was not signed under wartime desperation conditions. It was signed during a formal state visit, Kim Jong-un traveling to Moscow in September 2023, Putin traveling personally to Pyongyang in June 2024. Heads of state do not make reciprocal historic bilateral visits for transactions. They make them for architecture. North Korean construction and engineering companies are operating in Russian-occupied Ukrainian territory, building infrastructure. That is not a wartime arrangement. That is economic integration being established for a post-conflict environment. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov stated publicly in January 2025 that the Mutual Defense Clause in the June 2024 treaty is, quote, real, binding, and will be honored. China has never once made that statement about the 1961 Sino-North Korean Mutual Defense Clause. Not in any official capacity, not in any recorded diplomatic context. That gap between the marriage of convenience framing and the treaty language, the bilateral state visits, the infrastructure investment, and the explicit Russian confirmation of binding obligation is not a messaging problem. It is structural evidence that the realignment is durable. Every serious student of Cold War history recognizes the signature. When the Warsaw Pact was formalized in 1955, Western analysts initially described it as a temporary response to West German rearmament, not a lasting strategic architecture. It lasted 36 years. Step back from the peninsula for a moment, because here is what all of this, the doctrine transfer, the written mutual defense guarantee, the two-patron deterrence problem actually means for the nuclear order that is held since 1945, because that is the real story. What I want you to take from this is not alarm. Alarm produces paralysis. What is useful is precision. The nuclear order since 1945 has rested on one foundational structural assumption, that nuclear weapons are the absolute last resort of a state facing complete existential destruction, not a diplomatic instrument to be deployed in graduated escalation sequences. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were followed by 78 years of non-use. Not because the weapons disappeared, not because every nuclear-armed leader was perfectly rational, but because a shared norm developed across adversaries that the threshold for actual use was categorically different from every other military threshold. What the Russia-DPRK alliance represents is two states, one nuclear-armed and one nuclear-aspiring, who are now formally treaty partners, and one of whom has spent 3 years publicly demonstrating that nuclear threats, deployed strategically at a level below actual use, produce measurable results in great power confrontations. That is a norm erosion event. And norm erosion in nuclear strategy does not reverse through diplomacy alone. It reverses only when the next actor who tests the norm fails publicly and completely. That has not happened. Now I want the counter-argument to have a genuinely fair hearing, because serious scholars, researchers at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, former State Department officials with genuine Pyongyang expertise, look at everything in this analysis and land in a considerably calmer place. Their argument is coherent. Russia's nuclear threats in Ukraine were ultimately contained by Western resolve. The threshold was not crossed. Kim Jong-un's 12 years of survival in power demonstrate consistent rationality, not recklessness. China's economic leverage over Pyongyang, controlling 90% of North Korean trade, remains the dominant variable and will be exercised before any peninsular conflict reaches nuclear escalation. That is a serious argument. And the part that is true, Kim Jong-un's fundamental rationality is real. He has never, across 20 separate provocations, miscalculated to the point of triggering a response that threatened his regime. That record matters. The honest picture, stripped of both the complacency and the alarm, is this. The Russia-DPRK alliance has not made nuclear war on the Korean peninsula inevitable. What it has done is materially increase the probability of the specific conditions under which miscalculation, not intent, but miscalculation, becomes likely. Miscalculation risk rises precisely when deterrent signals must be sent to two patrons simultaneously, when treaty obligations create response pressures that neither patron fully controls in advance, and when a norm of nuclear coercion has been publicly validated on a different continent with visible effect. That is the structural change, not a decision, a condition. Conditions are harder to reverse than decisions. Here is what to watch. 3 specific signals that will tell you, before any headline announces it, which direction this actually resolves. Watch Russian diplomatic language around Article 4 of the June 2024 treaty. When Russian officials begin explicitly invoking that clause in direct response to US-South Korea joint military exercises, not hypothetically, but specifically and publicly, the deterrence threshold has visibly moved. Watch North Korea's next nuclear test design. If the test configuration moves from a simple fission device toward a miniaturized warhead capable of fitting on a multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicle, the technology transfer from Russia is confirmed, and the ICBM threat calculus against the continental United States changes fundamentally. Watch Beijing's public language about the Russia-DPRK relationship specifically. If China begins to openly and formally criticize the partnership, rather than its current posture of deliberate diplomatic silence, the three-way triangle is fracturing, and the strategic picture becomes considerably more manageable. Those 3 signals, not the summits, not the press conferences, not the breaking news alerts. Someone has to connect these pieces cleanly before the picture completes itself in conditions that no longer leave room for clarity. Now you have the map. The question is not whether this alignment is building. The evidence is unambiguous that it is. The question is whether enough people understand it clearly before the moment when that understanding would actually matter.